new book, The Storm of the Century. Al Roker is co-host and weather anchor of NBC's Today. He joins me from the NPR studios in New York City. And throughout the hour, we'll take your calls, comments, questions, 800-433-8850. Send us your email to drshow@wamu.org. Follow us on Facebook or send us a tweet. Al Roker, it's a pleasure to see you.
Oh, thank you. Nice seeing you, Diane. I actually can't see you because we're streaming right now.
So we're streaming right now. Al Roker, I want you to know this is a really gripping story, and I wonder what started you on it.
Well, I was, this was about a year and a half ago, and I was already thinking about the 10-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And so I started looking into that, and boy, everybody in meteorology, you talk about major hurricanes and you always have to talk about Galveston. And I started reading up more about it again. It had been a long time since I had looked at it. And the more I read about it, I thought, my gosh, this is, look, Katrina was horrible. There's no question about it. But the death toll and the devastation in Galveston really dwarfs Katrina. And I thought, you know what, I really think that there's something here. And so I started looking into it a little bit more and a little bit more. And I realized there was so much. And look, first of all, right off the bat, Eric Larson's book, Isaac's Storm, about Isaac Klein, the hurricane meteorologist who was based in Galveston. He wrote really what I consider the definitive book on it. And so, and I don't even consider myself in the same league as Eric Larson, but his book on the Lusitania I just finished, and it's just amazing. But I thought that there were a lot of other stories to tell, and so I hired a great guy, a researcher named Bill Hoagland, who just does amazing work, and found all these amazing stories and all these poignant stories, and we were able to, I think, through that research, I was able to then kind of weave these stories together. And what was great about it was you didn't have to embellish anything. There was there. You didn't have to. It's all there.
It's all there.
The thing that I find gratifying is the number of people who have come up to me and said, "This is a movie. I could see this as a movie," And you almost think it's too fantastical to be a movie, because it is the ultimate disaster movie, but it's also the ultimate survival movie, and the ultimate rebirth movie, because so much happens in this, and there's so many intersections at the turn of the century of great historical fact and figures.
But what struck me is that Galveston at the time had a population of about 37,000. And the estimates are that 10,000 people died. Yeah. Is that an accurate figure?
We don't know for sure, but you can go anywhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people. But rest assured, about a third of their population perished. It is still the worst natural disaster to ever befall this country.
Take us back to that year of 1900. Who was there in Galveston? What was it like? How did they manage? Was it prosperous? Was it struggling? What was it like?
It was an amazingly prosperous city. Now, when you think about less than 100 years earlier, this sandbar was claimed by Jean Lafitte, the pirate. And you go forward, and it has become a prosperous port city, more prosperous than New Orleans. It was considered, in a way, the Paris of the Gulf Coast. They had electricity before most cities in Texas and most cities in the South. They had sidewalks, they had boardwalks, they had grand promenades, they had telephone, they had telegraph. There were more, as you mentioned, 37,000 people. There were more millionaires per capita in Galveston than any other city in the United States.
Wow.
It was an extremely prosperous city. Population-wise, it was very interesting in that you had whites, Hispanics, you had Jews, You had blacks all living there, and for black people, it was there was still segregation. There was still a lot of oppression. And in fact, a lot of people didn't realize. I didn't realize that the African American holiday Juneteenth about emancipation started in Galveston. It was really a very interesting city at the time, and a very progressive city. And a very because of the trade of cotton and of sugar and shipping, it was really everybody thought that there was nothing they couldn't do.
And what did people there think about hurricanes at the time?
They had been hit by big storms, and they always cleaned up. But there was nothing that it wasn't anything they couldn't handle. And there had been talk about building a seawall, but there was a very look, at the turn of the century, America was feeling really good. We were America, and there was nothing we couldn't do and nothing we couldn't handle. And so while there had been storms, there was nothing that it wasn't that people couldn't deal with. There had been some flooding, there had been some beach erosion, there had been some damage, but they always built it back, and people went about their business.
You mentioned Eric Larson's book about Isaac Klein, but tell us about him. He was one of the country's best meteorologists.
Yes, especially when it came to hurricane forecasting. Nobody was considered better than Isaac Klein. And his brother Joseph was there with him. They basically, the U.S. Weather Bureau, it was really a part of the War Department and eventually spun off and became what we call today the National Weather Service. So it was really an amazing place to be for a weatherman. And at the time, this was before computers. This was before satellite. This was before radar.
Yeah.
This was before weather balloons.
Sure.
Where information was collected manually and sent via telegraph to Washington, D.C., and then disseminated out. So by the time you got your information, it was already hours old. But the state of the art at the time, before digital stuff came in, they pretty much had what was the state of the art and what we were using as far as physical instruments right up until the 1950s and 60s. But they really they did a remarkable job of what they had to work with. But what was even more fascinating was that the Cuban government and the Cubans, well, not even the government, the Jesuits in Cuba were the foremost hurricane specialists in the world. They had a network, a telegraphic network in the Caribbean that allowed them to study and accurately predict hurricane movement and strength.
Even Isaac Klein really did not believe that a major hurricane could really do huge damage to Galveston.
Well, he thought it could, but that as long as they could predict it, they could protect against it. And the sad part was, and it's kind of prescient, that through political and some professional jealousies, the U.S. Weather Bureau did not want to believe what Cuba had to say about hurricanes. And so through a series of maneuvers, the Cuban forecasting was cut off from the United States. So, and as this storm was coming in and rolled across the Caribbean, the Cubans knew, one Jesuit priest knew, that this was going to be a bad storm, and that most likely it was going to strike somewhere along the U.S. Gulf Coast, and most likely strike somewhere in Texas. But because the U.S. government and the War Bureau and the U.S. Weather Bureau didn't want that information disseminated, because they felt that we didn't need the Cubans don't know what they're talking about, and we are better than they are. And so
Isaac
it was
Klein
walled off.
himself said,
Isaac Klein,
you didn't need to build a seawall. And everybody listened to him.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, it was hubris. There was a lot of hubris involved. And a lot of lives could have been saved, but it was, to watch this happen was as I went through the research, and even though you know what's going to happen, you wish that it wasn't. That, oh my gosh, if only they had done this, if only and they had done that.
Al
So many lives
Roker,
could have been saved.
he's the author of the new book titled Storm of the Century: Tragedy, Heroism, Survival, and the Epic True Story of America's Deadliest Natural Disaster, the Great Gulf Hurricane of 1900. Do join us after a break.
Support for NPR comes from